within the local community. It might be Gazza from the football club, who you've known since school. It might be someone that you've seen do good things in their own business. And they're not necessarily a formal leader. And they may, in fact, in many respects, move away from formal leadership roles because that's not what really interests them. But when it comes to bringing about change, they're the one who walk up to you and say, actually, mate, it's time to do something about that, and you do it. And it's a different leadership role from one we normally think about in terms of what happens across our society and across our regions. And I also have then put this across an axis, bridging and bonding, and they're both forms of social capital. So what's social capital? Social capital used to be the trendy buzz phrase of the early 2000s. Social capital is your ability to network. And the OECD uses a definition which I find quite nice, which is it's the ability to gain resources through networks. So I want to achieve X. I want to get football tickets. No football tickets to have. I ring up a mate, I get football tickets. I want to get advice about what my kid should be doing at university. I don't know much about that, so I ring up someone who knows someone and they can get my child into the course coordinator to give them information, and on that basis they make a better decision. So social capital is about the networks we have, and some people have more networks and some people have fewer networks. Some people have strong networks, some people have poor networks. Some places have more social capital and some places have less. Conventionally, we think regional Australia or rural communities actually have a lot more social capital than you'll find in capital cities. And down here, we also have two forms, bridging social capital and bonding social capital, which I'll talk about in a little while. So what's the difference between bridging and bonding social capital? Well, bonding social capital is the social capital you have in a really tight group. So who's been part of a football team, a netball team, a bowling club, a rowing club, an athletics club? Did you have good group spirit, good team spirit? Yep, that's bonding social capital. Bonding social capital is what keeps you tight with your group. So this is actually a very interesting example. In the year 2000, I lived in Derry in Northern Ireland, which of course is famous because it really was at the front line of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And this is a community called The Fountain. And the thing about The Fountain is that it's a Protestant community that lives in the middle of a Catholic part of Derry. And in Northern Ireland, it's very simple. Everything's A or B. It's either Protestant or Catholic, or if you're like me, you're lucky you're a foreigner, so it doesn't matter. And what you see here is actually a big pyre they're building for a bonfire night to celebrate the day the apprentice boys locked the gates in the 17th century to keep out the Catholic part of the army of King James. And they do this every year around July the 12th. They have this huge bonfire, and it helps bring that community together. It drives their Catholic neighbours nuts. Now, I'm not going to judge whether Catholics are about the Catholic and Protestant issue. All I can say is they do a lot of things to each other just to annoy each other. So this is what is referred to, and I think quite euphemistically, as a peace wall. If you've ever read the book 1984 by George Orwell, you know he refers to Newspeak. Well, a peace wall is Newspeak. So what do we see? This is actually a very sunny day in Derry. Just be grateful you live in Australia, not Northern Ireland. This was mid-July. This is a sunny day. So what you have here is a Catholic community on this side and a Protestant community on this side. How do I know which is which? Because they've got the Union Jack on this side of the peace wall. If it was a flag at all, they'd probably have a Republic of Ireland flag here, and they'd probably paint the curbs here orange, white and green. Over this side they'd paint their curbs red, white and blue. You never quite have any doubt about which side of the fence you're on. The thing about the peace wall, and they've been building them since 2000 again, is that essentially it keeps the two communities apart. There's only 2 or 3 points of entry and exit. And this wall is high enough that you can't effectively lob anything over the top. You can't throw off a Molotov cocktail, you can't throw off a grenade. It's high enough that you can't actually throw it up high and hit someone. You might get close to them, but not quite effectively. Strong, if I go back, strong bonding social capital in the region leads to some very adverse outcomes more broadly, which then leads me on to my next point, bridging social capital. Bridging social capital. Bridging social capital is the social capital that lets us connect more broadly. It's our ability and our willingness and our openness to go beyond our small clique, our small group, and connect more powerfully. And I was thinking about bridging social capital as I prepared this, and I thought, who's a good example of this? Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton comes into a room. Hello. Hello. Great to see you all. I'm your best friend. I'm your best friend yesterday, I'm your best friend now, I'll be your best friend tomorrow. Bridging social capital, the ability to form connections. And one of the points about Bill Clinton is that he also has a connection with Northern Ireland, because under his presidency he put a lot of effort into forming a peace accord in Northern Ireland. And my wife was there in Derry in 2000 when he came to sign a document in the Derry Town Hall, and he just worked the crowd. He worked the crowd. Now, one of the points I'd make is that bridging social capital is often quite thin, but it does allow those loose connections to be formed over time. So what I want to suggest to you is that, if I go back a bit, what I suggest to you is that we often have our office holders, our formal leaders, the people recognised as leaders, are very strong on this idea of bridging social capital. But they're so busy and so out there forming connections more broadly that they in fact aren't necessarily deeply embedded in making connections within the community within which they live. Whereas the socially embedded leader lives within that community, has grassroots within that community, but their connections more broadly might be somewhat limited, and unless you have that broader connection, you don't actually get exposed to external influences and you can't make representations more broadly. So both forms of social capital are needed to bring about effective leadership at the regional scale. And there are different types of leadership, and then some types of leadership are better suited to different types of situations. But in the longer term, all forms of leadership are needed. So this really suggests to us that leadership is a collective action. It's something that can't be taken up by that one heroic individual, rather than being an individual effort. And importantly also, leadership will shift over time. Something comes in to challenge the region, the office holder leader takes up the challenge, but really has to communicate that message to the socially embedded leader to bring along the community with them. Because that person is the person who the community as a whole will look to and model their behaviour over time. Both bridging and bonding social capital are needed, and regional Australia, which is often rich in social capital, is obviously well placed to think about these leadership roles and take advantage of them, but often the gap isn't in bonding social capital, it's in bridging social capital, which of course has implications about how we work into the future. So, just to conclude then, my key argument is that leadership matters. Unless a region can break out of the policy silos, they'll get what Canberra or Macquarie Street in Sydney will give them. And good luck to you. That's the reality. You have very little opportunity to shape your future. You have very little opportunity to respond to the challenges that your region is confronted by. There are leadership deficits in Australia's regions, and one of the things that I've argued in my own presentation last year is that there's a question about slack resources. Leaders need to have the time to lead, and in regions where you have many people working their butts off all the time, they've got no time to invest in leadership roles. They have no opportunity to invest in leadership roles, and the regions suffer. And government policy can also undermine leadership potential by stripping away some of the leaders out of the region, by cutting back on public sector jobs, by cutting back on investment in the region as well. Which then leads me to the point I'd like to make. And it's a point that really is implicit in the sort of material I discussed with both Chris Kalinge and Marku Sotoratu. It's that institutions can be pivotal for leadership at any scale. And when I say institutions, I mean something bigger than the individual. It can be a bank, it can be a regional government, it can be a local government, it can be an RDA, it can be a cooperative, it can be a private business. But it's a form of collective established action that can bring about change. It's a form of collective established action that has longevity. Leadership is something that requires longevity. There's no point in solving the problems of today if you then drop the ball tomorrow. So leadership based on institutions has intrinsic advantages over individuals in terms of the range of leadership styles and the continuity they can offer. They can be both socially embedded leaders and they can also be bridging leaders. They can be leaders today, they can be leaders tomorrow, and they can be leaders 10 years into the future. But we always have to recognise that it's individuals who decide to take on a leadership role in the institution. And so part, I think, of the challenge in the future for all regions across Australia is to think about how we foster those leaders and those people willing to take on leadership roles. Thank you very much.